All right, welcome back, folks, to the Quiet Light podcast. Today we have part two of the discussion between Joe and myself about EXITpreneur. But as always, this episode is brought to you by Quiet Light Brokerage, where we've been helping entrepreneurs prepare and exit their online businesses for the past 14 years. And we work with clients in the e-commerce space, SaaS space, content space. If it's online, that is what we love to work with. Joe, I'm excited about the second part of the conversation today. I think last week we talked a lot about just kind of why did you do this, right? Why would you take on such a massive project as writing a book and launching a book, which for anyone that's been through that process before, they know it's not a small undertaking at all. Today, I think it'd be better for us to get into some detail. I mean, what can people actually expect to see from this? Is this a lot of fluff, a lot of stories, or how meaty do we get? So today, let's dig into some of that. Can you start out just by giving kind of an overview of the chapters, and maybe then we can dig into a chapter?
Yeah. And one of the things we're doing in this podcast, in the show notes, folks, is we're going to give you links to the introduction of the book and to 3 separate chapters. That'll be part of the show notes, so you can review it, access it. If all you want to read about is deal structures, which we're going to talk about today, is one of the chapters, read it. It's yours. Share it with anybody and everybody you know. It's there for the taking. But the book itself does get very meaty, but it shares some stories as well, right? I've built, bought, and sold a combination of 6 different companies, and been involved in hundreds of transactions myself. And I share some of those success stories and epic failures of individuals. I change names where necessary, and I use first names as well. Sometimes
all the epic failures were mine, right?
All of them.
We can pull the mask off.
Current and past. There's that was a separate book, though. No,
that's the follow-up. Yeah. Failopreneur, right?
Failopreneur. I like that. I'm gonna trademark. No, and somebody else already bought it. They heard you say it. Now they bought the URL.
It's gone. It's gone.
But we do get meaty, and one of the things that I think is really beneficial for both sides of the transaction, both buy side and sell side, is the chapter on deal structures and structuring the deal points. And so I wanted to dig into that because I know our audience is full of both buyers and sellers.
All right, well, let's get into that. Let's get into that chapter as far as structuring a deal. This is a big part, right, of the transaction, because deals can be structured in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different ways to cut up this sort of transaction. So why don't we get into how you break this chapter down?
Okay. So there's as you say, there's a lot of different points to it, right? It's the variations of common deal structures are many. It's cash, seller notes, holdbacks, earnouts, stability payments, rolling equity, working capital pegs, and then inventory notes if you've got a physical product business. And so we delve into each of those points in great detail in this particular chapter. Let's just start out with cash. You would think that cash is simply cash, right? What's the big deal? You're buying a business for cash. But obviously, there's variations to cash as well. For buyers that want to keep some of their cash for themselves, they can do a combination. Instead of just, I'm going to pay you $1 million all cash, you can do cash plus a holdback, cash plus a stability payment or seller note or earnout equity roll, or some combination of all of the above. And for physical product companies, what we're seeing is that the aggregators are being very, very good at doing a combination of all of the above. So let's jump into it. We're going to jump into some of the different things. The easiest one to focus in on is seller notes. Now, that's something, Mark, that we don't see, or historically haven't seen that often on our transactions, right?
Right. And when we do, it's typically a pretty small minority of the deal. Yeah.
That's right. It's generally, I think what I talk about in the book is actually the largest seller note I personally have ever seen is 50%. And it was because the buyer and seller absolutely fell in love with each other. It was 2 women. They were both nearing retirement age. One was buying the business, the other was selling the business, and they got along like long lost sisters. And it worked very well for the seller to have a larger seller note that was going to pay out over time. She did 50% for 5 years, which is rare. But it benefited her personally because she had a portfolio of investments that she wanted to let mature over the next 5 years. So in the sale of the business, this was going to give her income to live off of while that investment was growing. But there's four deal things I focus in on under seller notes, and one, most people want to say, no, I'm not ever going to do a seller note because I don't trust my buyer. You're going to get to know your buyer over time, and then you'll be able to make that decision to say yes or no once you get to know them. But either way, you want to have that note, try to get that secured personally by the buyer and with the assets of the business. And this is where a good attorney, good contract attorney comes into play. You want to have them secured. Most business transactions that we've seen with seller notes, again, it's a smaller portion, 25% or less, normally, often just 10%. But the length of that note is generally 12 to 36 months. That's what's most common. And there are exceptions that are longer, some that are much shorter, and that we'll get into on the inventory note. As far as interest rates go, look, you're not a bank, but you should get paid. But when you do the math on a $100,000 seller note and you go from 6% to 10%, it doesn't really move the financial needle all that much. So you just need to do something that's a fair and reasonable interest rate. You're not a credit card company, but again, do the math on what it would be like, and you'll find that you're just not going to move the needle that much on a $100,000 note.
What sort of interest rates do you list interest rates in the book?
It varies. So look, on an SBA loan, you're going to get anywhere, we've seen anything from 5 to 7%. I think if you could take the top side of that and add 8%, it's fair and reasonable. But going to 16% or something like that, which I've seen some sellers want to do, it just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, right. Now, I know a lot of questions that sellers have on this topic of a seller note is, how do I guarantee I get paid? And what happens if the person doesn't pay me? Do you address that in the book at all?
We do. One of the things that you want to do in terms of setting up the payment structure is to make sure you're not collecting a check or needing to go anywhere to get your money, that it simply has to be automatic. And then we drill into, do you want to sleep at night and get paid on a monthly basis? Or do you want to get paid on a quarterly basis and sleep a little less? There are some seller notes where buyers are going to try to pay you on an annual basis. None of that makes any sense to me. It should be on a monthly basis, and it's automatically drafted from their account. So there's no human error, and somebody has to remember to do it. But as far as guaranteeing you're getting paid, look, life has no guarantees whatsoever. That's where you've got to have a strong asset purchase agreement that details the clear steps to be taken in the event the buyer defaults. And again, that's where a good attorney comes in play, and you've got to have one. If you're going to sell a business for, I would say, $250,000 and up, you should plan on spending anywhere from $3,000 to $10,000 on a good quality contract attorney that's going to protect you in the event of something going wrong after the sale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are some mechanisms you can do to protect yourself. I know escrow.com offers like a domain holding escrow service, which can be used. It's not used commonly just because they're very expensive to use. And there are different things you can put in place. I don't know if you remember this, Joe. I did an interview years ago with the owner of BrainHost, who had sold his business to his business partners, and they ended up defaulting on payments, and he ended up getting the business back. And we went through that journey. What was that like? How did he go through getting the business back? And there's just 2 points that I want to bring up on this. One, it was such a remarkable story that somebody actually had to do this, that I thought it was worthy of an interview, right? I didn't want to let it slip because we don't hear about it all that often. It doesn't happen all that. I mean,
it's rare. It's the exception rather than the rule.
It really is the exception. And then number 2, he was able to get the business back and in good order. So it ended up working out and being a success story with some bumps along the way, which, People hear that and like, oh my gosh, I don't want to deal with that. Well, what is business? Business is nothing but hopefully a success story with some bumps along the way.
Yeah.
That's our journeys.
That's the thing, when you're selling your business and you're going to take any kind of seller note, you need that note to be small enough so that the cash is big enough so that the buyer has a lot of skin in the game. They're desperately not wanting to fail because they're going to lose that entire amount that they gave you, and you're probably still going to get the business back. I had a similar conversation with somebody. I didn't do a podcast, but a similar conversation with someone. Oh, look what Joe forgot to do. He forgot to mute his phone. Sorry, folks.
It's like we're not professional podcasters.
I know. Imagine that. And that was Paul Anderson, one of our amazing advisors. So it was actually at an event for Helium 10. I forget the name of the event that they had, but someone had sold their business through the buyer used an SBA loan. So there was a lot of cash in the game. There might have been a 20% seller note that time, which was really, really high. Generally, it's 10% or less now. But the buyer defaulted on the SBA loan. The bank reached out to the seller and said, hey, they defaulted. Would you take this over and own it 50-50 with us? So he got 80% of the money for it and then got the business back and owned 50%. And he had grown it like crazy and was selling it again and getting a second payday. So it wasn't the path that he intended to go on, but it worked out pretty well for him financially.
That's remarkable. Again, these are rare stories, and so when we hear about them, it's something that does stand out. One other element, and then we'll move on to the next item in your list here. I just try and explain to people with a seller note to not think about the entire seller note as being at risk, right? A seller note grows riskier the further out it gets, right? So year one is typically not a super high risk note. Year two might be just a slightly more risky than that. If you had, for some odd reason, a 10-year note, that 10th year is probably relatively high risk of defaulting. And so to think about your seller note in that way as so risk increasing over time, as opposed to the whole note being at an equal amount of risk, which is where your point to monthly payments being preferable, and possibly, some people do like to structure balloon payments. I'm not in favor of those because that balloon payment is the most risky payment at the end of a note. So
and that's why a 12 to 36 month note is most common, because as Mark just said, the further out you go, the higher the risk is of getting paid. These are businesses that people grow, and eventually they make an investment, they want to grow it, and they eventually want to sell it in many cases. So 12 to 36 month is most common and comfortable and safest as well.
All right, so we have cash. Cash is pretty easy to understand. It's coming from somebody's account or an SBA loan, but for the seller, for the person selling, that's money that goes in your bank account right away. Seller note is money that gets into your bank account over time. And again, people often use a combination of cash and a seller note, or they want to use a combination, I should say, of cash and a seller note. And our history is the seller note's a minority portion, 15, 20%, 10% in that neighborhood.
Yeah, and they're generally reserved for larger deals, right?
Right.
It's you're not going to do a seller note generally on a $250,000, $300,000 deal. We've got plenty of all cash buyers for that. And what they'll implement is part number 2 here, which is moving on to holdbacks. A holdback is something that's used most often with cash deals, and it's tied to the training and transition period. So most often we've got language in an asset purchase agreement that talks about a training and transition period being for up to, and these are keywords, up to 40 hours over the first 90 days after closing. When you're training and transitioning your business to the new owner, you're not running and operating the business for them. You're there to support them and help them as things come up, share your SOPs and guide them through those. This holdback is, again, used mostly for cash deals, and it's a carrot for the seller to stick around and help during training and transition. And buyers use that most often in cash deals. It gives buyers peace of mind that you're going to be there to help them, and is a carrot for you to stick around. In the decade that I've been doing this, there's only been one holdback that has not been released. And it was a special circumstance. I do talk about it in the book. Very, very odd special circumstance. And it got released back to the buyer of the business. The seller never got it because she disappeared off the face of the earth. She was,
Yeah.
yeah. But you're going to see something like, in the asset purchase agreement, or even starts in the letter of intent, something like language that would read, a holdback equal to 10% of the purchase price will be held in escrow, and we'll talk about that in a sec, during a training and transition period of 90 days and then released. Simple, clear language with no milestones or anything other than that 90-day period and the up to 40 hours. You want to use up to in case all the seller needs is 3 hours. You're not obligated to commit to 40 hours. I'm sorry, the buyer. But generally 10% is about what we see. And we want it held in escrow. That way you're not worried about the buyer paying you. It's just in escrow and it is released in 90 days unless the buyer disputes something and attorneys get involved. And again, I've seen that once in 10 years. Have you seen that more than that one time in that situation we had that with that? I don't know.
Yeah, there's
called a woman.
There's been a few. Yeah, there's been a few scenarios where we've seen it. It really, again, it probably count on one hand, maybe breaking another second hand. The training transition is the element that is often there. The other elements, though, and where I've seen disputes before, have been post-close realizations or discoveries of things that maybe were not disclosed properly before the deal. So maybe a massive return of inventory that ends up being docked out, or something else along those lines. Oftentimes with e-commerce businesses, holdbacks are used for post-closing adjustments that need to happen. And those are typically pretty minor. I've seen one case, Joe, this was actually really interesting. I won't say who, but we both know the buyer on this one pretty well. I've seen one case where there was a holdback in order to benefit the seller from a tax standpoint. And that holdback was actually requested by the seller in order to put some money out into the future in order to save things. But let me ask you just an objection. I know people on the sell side are thinking, and for those that are on the buy side, I really want you to understand this point as to the psychology of the seller. When a seller hears holdback, and the holdback is here as a carrot, their worry is, this guy's going to work me, or this woman's going to work me and force me to work this business. I'm going to be constantly under pressure of, oh my gosh, I've got $50,000, $100,000 hanging out here that I don't get unless they give me a thumbs up. Is that the nature of this?
It's really not. It's really not. There's they don't have to give you a thumbs up. It's if the language is written properly in the LOI and the APA, it's just automatic released. Because again, it's your training, it's completely tied to the training and transition period and the language that is in there. And it's simple language. And the training and transition is, basically up to 40 hours over the first 90 days. And then the money's released. Simple as that. It's not complex. And it needs to be there for, cash deals. So the seller sticks around because it gives the buyer a great deal of peace of mind. The peace of mind for the seller is the language and the way it's written, and the fact that it's not in the seller's bank account. It's in an escrow account with an attorney or through escrow.com or Zoom Escrow, which I talk about in the book. Shaquille Prosla and Sean Hussein have launched a company called Zoom Escrow to compete with escrow.com. I don't know if you knew that or not.
I did not, but yeah, I want to emphasize this point because this is the key to a holdback being really effective, and kind of allaying the fear on the seller side of, oh, I need to win their approval in order to get this money. Holding the funds in escrow. It's not in that buyer's bank account. The buyer does not control those funds. So the only mechanism that they have to be able to get those funds back is by filing an objection to releasing the funds. And that doesn't automatically get the funds back. That starts a process in which they have to make a case and for why those funds should be back. And the arbiter initially is really just the buyer and the seller, right? And so you asked me, have I seen more cases? Yes, I've seen more cases. Again, probably one hand, maybe two hands, the number of cases or thousands of deals that we've done. But when I see that happen, you know what the result is? Usually a week of conversations and then a resolution, because nobody wants to go there. Nobody wants to go to that fight. It usually isn't a fight. There's usually, if there's a reason to file an objection, there's usually actually a reason to do it. And if there's not, I've never seen somebody file an objection just frivolously. It doesn't happen.
Keep in mind, we're spending conversation on stuff that happens like 1% of the time. It's very rare. It's the exception rather than the rule that there's any issue with a holdback being released. It's usually just automatically released.
Yeah, and I only bring it up because you're right. It doesn't happen, but it's the fear. And
it's the fear.
Question.
Yeah. That's
why I bring. All right. Holdbacks. So holdbacks are a common thing. I like holdbacks. I think that they work well for everybody, including the sellers. I think that they're a good mechanism to have when structured properly. All right. So we have seller financing. We have holdbacks. We have cash. What's next?
Earnouts. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
How do earnouts work? I hate that question.
Yeah.
How do earnouts work? It depends on.
So, earnouts typically, in my view, have always been reserved for businesses that are trending down and they're in trouble and somebody needs to jump on that shit and plug all the holes, put out the fires, that type of thing. Or the complete opposite, where the seller of the business is trying to capture upside because the business is growing like crazy. It's changed a little bit as our listings get larger, and the aggregators in the FBA space are trying to get earnouts into everything, and they've done a really good job as marketing them as profit sharing programs, which is stunning, but it's really an earnout. And so what I do in the book is break down the different types of things that you should focus on in an earnout. And the first is, don't ever accept an earnout, if at all possible, right? Exceptions to every rule, as a percentage of EBITDA or profits or net income or discretionary earnings or whatever language somebody wants to put in there. Sometimes they'll even do it as gross profit. In my view, it's just simple math that if somebody's insisting on it being a percentage of gross profit or a percentage of net income, that dollar amount that would equal can be calculated as a much smaller percentage of something that's much more measurable, easy to measure without any trickery, and that's a percentage of total revenue. My first advice is make that payment a percentage of total revenue and nothing else. That way it's very easily measured with no trickery involved whatsoever. And again, just like with a seller note, the shorter the better. You're going to be friends with your buyer, or your buyer is going to be friends with you, the seller, until something goes wrong, right? The further out you go, the more risk there is. And if something goes wrong, they may find a way to manipulate that net income number to reduce how much they're paying you. And that's why I think it's best to tie it to the top line revenue number.
Well, and I think it doesn't even have to be trickery, right? When I bought the last business I bought, which is years ago now, the person I bought it from was running it as a solo business. Essentially, he was doing all of the work. I don't have the capacity to do that. I brought on staff right away. So he was earning, let's just say $100,000 per year. I took on that business for different reasons. When I took it over, I was not earning $100,000 per year because I was paying staff to do most of what he was doing. If we had an earnout tied to bottom line earnings, look what happens, right? All of a sudden, those bottom line earnings were sapped up. Alternatively, the buyer might want to try a different initiative. They might want to try a different advertising program that doesn't work. It's really tricky. What you have to do if you're going to tie to bottom line earnings, which I agree, don't, unless there's some really crazy exception, is you have to define what that is, and you have to limit what that is, right? We agree that EBITDA will be defined as no more advertising expense than 20% of revenue. It becomes super complex. Revenue is the easiest. Gross profit is an understandable one. I think a decent compromise position
for clearly define gross profit, because we see P&Ls that have gross profit with all sorts of things above that line.
Yes, absolutely. You're right there. Gross profit has a definition, right? And it is a fairly clear definition. That doesn't mean people are always using it the right way, but yes, the clearly defined metrics are what makes sense. Yeah. When it comes to earnouts, though, Joe, do you go into obviously you talked about a percentage of revenue as or percentage of some number. do you go into other types of earnout scenarios, such as goals and targets?
Yes, absolutely. We go into, there's actually 5 points. The first one is making payment a percentage of revenue. The second one, pretty simple, make monthly payments, steady monthly payments, just like seller notes, remove that doubt, concern, and the stress of the unknown. The third one is what you're addressing now, which is financial caps. As a buyer, what you might want to do is, present an earnout that is structured so that the percentage that they're going to get is a percentage of total revenue up to a certain dollar amount. So X is the percent and Y is the total dollar amount. There's a cap there. You're not going to pay them, 5% of total revenue for 3 years, because if you grow the business like crazy, you're going to pay them a lot more. Sellers, that's what you want. Buyers, that's not what you want. You want to do buyers, you want to do a percentage of revenue up to, let's say, $100,000. So the earnout, let's say you're buying a business for $1 million and you want to do 10% of that as an earnout, and they're going to get 5% of revenue up to $100,000. This balances the risk between the buyer and the seller, so that if the business grows like crazy because the buyer has done some amazing stuff or just continues to do what the seller did, that you do that math so that 100,000 is paid out in 24 months if the growth continues the same at 5%. But if the buyer does something that it doubles in 12 months, the seller's going to get paid out much sooner. Conversely, if the business is not all it was cracked up to be, or the seller does something, or the buyer does something that just didn't make sense, and revenue is flat, and that instead of it growing like crazy, it flatlines or goes down a little bit, it's a balance of risk, and that earnout is going to take longer. So you do the math on $100,000 getting paid out in 24 months as a percentage of total revenue up to a cap. But if the business goes down, it will take maybe 36 months, or really in a situation where it goes down a lot, could be 48 months. And that oddly benefits the seller in a certain way. And it's because, again, the further out, the more risk there is in this situation. The business is in a little bit of trouble, but the seller is not taking everything they could possibly take from the business at a fixed dollar amount. With the seller, no, they're taking a percentage of it. And it leaves more cash for the current owner of the business to right that ship and fix it. The last thing on the earnout and the financial cap is that earnouts are used by buyers to keep the seller involved and motivated. And so if things go astray and you want to reach out to that seller, but beyond that, initial 90-day period, they're kind of going to be there for you because they're still getting paid as a percentage of total revenue and they want the business to succeed. But that financial cap as a percentage of total revenue up to Y is something that does actually work well in both the buyer and seller's favor.
Yeah, with the earnouts, the one thing I'm just going to say about this, you just hearing you talk about this, and I'm sure people that are listening to this is something that probably is more digestible when you read it as well.
Absolutely. It's deep.
Yeah, earnouts are I consider them to be like the advanced ninja way of structuring a deal, right? Because they can really accelerate your profits from a sale, and they can also work against you and cause you to lose out value if you don't know what you're doing. But where we see the most value out of transactions, in my opinion, is when somebody smartly structures an earnout, right? When they're able to figure out and devise a structure which allows them to get ample cash at close, plus a lot of upside on that. And when that business takes off afterwards, especially depending on who's buying the business, there can be a significant amount of added value. You might sell your business for 2.8, 3, 3.2 in terms of cash, but then be able to see a 4 or a 5 or an effective 6+ sort of multiple on the earnout if it's structured right, and if you figure out the right things.
And that's where, as a seller, you don't want that financial cap, right? You don't want to be limited to $100,000 or $200,000. You just want 5% of total revenue, for 36 months or 48 months or something like that. And I'm saying 5% just as a round number. It's not that. The fourth point in the earnout structure is pretty simple. Keep it short, right? If you're doing a cap, try to do it over a 24-month period. Again, as Mark said earlier, the further out it goes, the riskier it gets. So for your purposes, keep it sweet and short, unless you're shooting for the moon and don't want that financial cap. Just keep it, at percentage of total revenue for as long as you can. The last point that we dive deep into in the book is actually, it's pretty simple, right? So you don't want a percentage of bottom line revenue because there's a lot of math and trickery, possible other expenses. Let's take the word trickery out of it, but other expenses that could be in there that weren't there when you were running the business. But you want to find a way to have the ability to have view-only access to the data that shows the actual revenues being produced. And in the case of an Amazon business, that's pretty clear and pretty simple. It's the Seller Central account. But view-only access to those type of reports will appease your stress and anxiety in the first few months. It will also help you be able to do the math instead of just trusting the math on the wire, the ACH that was deposited to your account. It should come with a report, but you should also be able to access that report and run it yourself, just as peace of mind.
Yeah, I'll run this out just with one thing. One lesson I've taken away. 14 years of doing this now for sellers on this, and that is know your buyer. Get to know your buyer and understand due diligence is a two-way street, right? Especially if there's an earnout involved. You have the possibility, you have the potential of actually getting more value from an earnout if you have a really good partner. If you like who's buying the business, you see that they have a lot of finances behind them, they have a lot of capability, they have a good track record. That's a company that I might hitch my wagon to a little bit and say, I'll take a little bit less cash, maybe at close for future upside, or maybe I'm going to just try and tap into that future upside. And but if I think that the buyer is, I hope they do well, I'm going to support them, but I'm not sure if I really trust them as much. Maybe at that point you throttle the deal more towards cash on your side, or look at that. So due diligence is a two-way street.
Right. And, part of what the purpose of the entire book is, and this particular chapter in itself is trying to remove this quote of, an ignorant mind always says no, because as you just said, there could be a real financial win if you hitch your wagon onto an earnout and a seller that you have a great deal of confidence in. Now, you don't know who they are when you list your business for sale, but I promise you that you will get to know them during that interview process, the LOI process, due diligence process, and so on and so forth. So you'll really get to know them. So just saying no out front is something that I'm trying to help people stop doing and be open to listening and learning and getting an education and training. As we talk about in the book, we're trying to, instead of exit planning, it's training. And this is part of it. Getting trained on the different types of deal structures that you may be presented with, and removing that an ignorant mind always says no.
Yeah, I don't want to belabor the point too much, but I'm going to just bring this point home with two examples here. Well, just one example. It's a silly example. Let's assume that you put your business up for sale and you find out the buyer's Elon Musk. Would you take an earnout from him? If it's a percentage of revenues for the next 3 years?
Yeah.
Right. And
great example.
If the plans are, I'm going to tweet it out to my gazillion followers on Twitter, right? The guy sold flamethrowers and made a bunch of money. Yes, of course you would, right? If it's a celebrity, and this happens, if it's a celebrity buying your brand and you know that they're now going to use their influence, I want to tap into that. So anyways, we can move on to the next.
All right, so we've gone cash, seller notes, holdbacks, earnouts. Last one, actually not the last one, the next one is something that if you Google it, you won't find it because it's a creation by these FBA aggregators. It's called stability payments. And it's an interesting one because it's really just a combination of a seller note and earnout, but they've given it a new name because they're amazing at marketing, so much better than we are, right? They coin these things that really it's just an earnout or it's just a stability payment. But the concept is pretty simple. It works like this. If the revenues, this is the way they frame it in a letter of intent. If the revenues of the business are within, let's say 90% of the trailing 12 months at closing, you, the seller, will be paid a stability payment of X. And the X is usually about 10% of the purchase price of your business, but it can definitely vary. So let's just say that your stability payment, let's go with $200,000, right? So you're selling your business for $2 million. Stability payment is 10%. So you're not going to get that 10%. That 10% is not going to be held in escrow. And you're only going to get that 10% if the revenue of the business is within 90% of where it was when they bought it 12 months after they bought it. It's interesting. The problem with the initial language that they will throw at you is that it's 90% or nothing, right? If it's at 89.99%, you will not get paid that $200,000. So there's a number of things that I talk about in the book, and it goes deep in this one because there's different things that you can do. But a simple one is it shouldn't be 90% or nothing. If it's 90%, you get your 200,000. If it's 85 to 90%, you get 150. If it's 80 to 85, you get 100. And then conversely, on the other side, if it's 90 to 95%, maybe you're going to get 250. If it's 95 to 100%, right? Because it is a blend of a seller note and earnout with a new name on it that you can't find if you Google it. You could try to tap into some upside as to it as well. And then that clear line of 90% is something you definitely want to avoid. So you're down and you're up. You can protect yourself on the downside, protect yourself on the upside. And then there's other things that you definitely want to have included in any of this. And one of them, with the stability payment in particular, is tied to, if you're a physical product company, an FBA seller, and you're bought by an aggregator, have your inventory on hand tied to this stability payment, so that if they run out of inventory on your top selling SKU for more than 1 week at a time or 2 weeks at a time, other than natural disasters, that all bets are off. You're getting your full stability payment within 3 weeks or something like that. Just because they are well financed and well recognized in this world doesn't mean that they're not going to take their eye off the ball and run out of inventory, right? They're growing like crazy. They're taking on all sorts of brands. They're hiring new people that are not as passionate about your brand as you are. And that increases the risk of doing something like running out of inventory. And I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen where we were 3 weeks away from a $300,000 payment and they ran out of inventory. We were at, whatever percent, we were really close, and then they ran out of inventory. Fortunately, there was a second clause in there that allowed it to roll over to the next quarter, and my client got paid the $300,000. Right. But we didn't, at that time, have that clause in there where all bets are off if you run out of inventory. I think I forget exactly what I wrote in the book. I've read it 20 times, but I still, when I read it now, it's like, oh, it's new. That's a good idea. Yeah. I think I talk about maybe a 2-week period, but I think it's a critical part to have in there when it comes to stability payments. You could probably work that into different types of seller notes and earnouts as well.
Yeah, when it comes to earnouts and stability payments and this area, and even just the structure of the deal, you're really limited only by your creativity. And so, keep an open mind. I've seen a stability payment, Joe, which I thought it's actually my favorite format of a stability payment. The way it worked is we calculated the multiple at the close for the business. And let's just say that was 3.7. The multiple for at the close of the business. 20% of the purchase price was in a seller note. Right. So there was a guaranteed amount of a seller note that was out there. However, the stability portion of this was the business is going to grow at the rate of 5% year over year. If it doesn't grow at the rate of 5% year over year, we're going to recalculate the trailing 12 months and the actual multiple on this, and we'll readjust that seller note accordingly. Right, so that seller note might go down a little bit. So it might go down from 200,000 to 185,000. Right, and then conversely, if it goes up, if it grows by a certain amount, we were going to recalculate what that seller note was. So in other words, what it did is it was like a volume knob on that seller note that would either increase or decrease. But there were still these guaranteed monthly payments. It was pegged to something that was very hard and firm. We were going to get paid. That was the real key there. There was going to be payment. How much? It was open to some interpretation and the performance of the business. But it was a really cool mechanism that I ended up. I looked at it, I'm like, this is creative. I like this. This is a good system, and it's worked out very, very well for that seller. that was creative. That's why I just say when people ask me, we go over this, and they're like, how do earnouts work? How does stability payments work? And I was like, well, it really depends. I mean, you can get creative with it. So kudos to you on trying to break this apart because it's a big topic.
It really is. It's, just that we have an affliction, right? We, all entrepreneurs, anybody listening to this podcast is an entrepreneur or an entrepreneur in the making. We have an affliction, and that is called, I can do this. I can do that. We think we can do everything. And the problem is that we can't. And when it comes to what you and I do, we've learned through, over a decade's worth of doing it, that no two deals are alike. They're all complex, and putting your biggest asset online and selling it yourself by thinking, I can do that. There's a really, really high percentage that you're not getting enough value for the business, doing a terrible deal structure, and just putting yourself at risk, your biggest asset at risk. So rather than saying, hey, everybody, you have to work with us, I said, hey, everybody, here's everything that we know. Mm-hmm. It's in this book. Study it, learn it, train, and then you kind of have a blue belt. You're not a black belt yet, but you've got your blue belt. You know just enough to be dangerous, and you're still going to get your ass kicked by somebody with a black belt or a brown belt. But I think there's enough education in there that they'll still make the decision that, just based upon what you just said, it makes a whole lot of sense to work with somebody that is an expert. And we earn our fee very, very much, 10 times over in most cases. All right, so
stability payments. Moving on.
Yeah, we're moving on to rolling equity. Rolling equity is something that it means a buyer purchases the majority of the business for cash, and you, the seller, roll the remaining percentage into a new co or new company that's set up by the buyer. So if you've got a business you're selling for $1 million and you want to roll 20% equity, there's a new entity that's set up. You're getting $800,000 in cash for the business, but your 20% is going to the ownership of that new entity that now operates the business. So the benefit to the seller is that you're getting a partial cash out. You relieve yourself of that daily grind, and you participate in the upside and an eventual second exit. Now you've got to trust your buyer, of course. The benefits to the buyer is that there is less cash needed at closing. You're saving yourself $200,000. Your seller is invested in your success and may stay on as a strategic advisor. A lot of the folks we work with are selling because they're just exhausted from the daily grind. They love certain aspects of the business, maybe launching new SKUs or podcasting or whatever it might be, but the daily grind is what they're tired of, or they've reached their limit of expertise and they need to sell. So they can stay on a strategic advisor. This is something that I've seen people, much like an earnout, where they don't have a cap and they make more money on the earnout than they do on the sale of the business. This one's rolling the dice a bit. You've got to work with somebody that's going to grow the business and have a real strong second exit down the road. But it's a good opportunity to get a second exit that could be larger than the first.
Yeah, and where I've seen this used most often would be deals that start sniffing the lower middle market, right? So the 10, 15, $20 million transactions. The expectation among private equity, family offices, or investors at that level would be some equity rolled. They know, and they really depend on that owner coming over, bringing over all the institutional knowledge that seller has built over the years, so that they don't lose that in the transition. And the reward can be significant for the person selling. It can be a really, really good situation to have that equity roll, because as you said, Joe, it's the second exit. Sometimes that second exit is significantly larger, and that even with 20% equity or 10% equity rolled over, that can represent more money than what you originally sold the business for. What you want to look for with that would be the health of the fund that is buying your company. Also, where are you at in their acquisition cycle? So are you the platform investment? Are you an add-on? Are they ready to exit pretty soon? Because remember, private equity, they don't want to buy and hold necessarily. They're looking to buy, grow, and sell. Right. That is the private equity model, which again can be really good. I've known people that have gone through those second exits, and they are often bigger than the original exit. So it can definitely be a huge win. It can also be something that is difficult because you're now working with a private equity after the fact. And so once again, know your buyer. Due diligence is a two-way street, and take advantage of that. Make sure that you know who's buying the company. I know of one client who had an offer from a private equity, and after investigating the private equity, backed out of the transaction because he didn't like the finances, the financials of the private equity, thought that they were carrying too much debt and didn't feel confident in their ability to execute. That's a fair reason to back out, given the structure of the deal. It made a lot of sense. And so
let me throw in that, in case you're out there listening going, oh, so I can get cash and then I'm owning another company and then I can't do anything else. No, you can do anything else as long as you're still going to have a non-compete clause in your asset purchase agreement. So you're not going to be able to go out and sell products in the same category or services in the same category that are going to compete for the same customer. But you can go out and start your new business doing something that you're more passionate about with, less bootstrapping and more cash on hand to do it. You can have more financial peace of mind. So you can still go out and go on your next adventure, while this one is, greatly reduced, and you're just having maybe a strategic call every quarter. Maybe you're on the board of advisors or something like that. So pretty simple, and you can still go out on your next adventure.
So now do we know everything about structuring a deal? No, we don't. There's more.
There's two more components to it. I'll tell you what they are. It's working capital pegs and inventory notes, and they're not all that complex, except that a working capital peg is more often called a peg, and what it is it's a benchmark, a target, a baseline amount of net working capital that's agreed upon by the buyer and seller, and is usually determined toward the end of financial due diligence. I have a massive problem with that. Buyers, generally are looking for a working capital peg of 1 to 3 months of working capital, so that their logic is, well, I'm not going to pay $1 million for your business and then have to put another $300,000 in it just to cover the first 3 months. It's a lot of money. I think not having it clearly defined in the letter of intent gives your buyer a strong position to negotiate for more and more in due diligence. So if you're going to have any kind of working capital peg presented to you in an offer, you got to have it clearly defined in dollar amounts. Otherwise, there's going to be a position for renegotiation and due diligence. And we don't see that. We don't see working capital pegs, the language in asset purchase agreements or letters of intent very often. What we are seeing, and this is the third time I've mentioned FBA rollups, and I apologize because this book is not just for a physical product e-commerce business owner selling on Amazon. It's for everybody. But for what we're seeing on the FBA side is the aggregators are, instead of calling it a peg, what they're doing is just asking for 2 to 3 months worth of inventory free with the purchase of the business. So they may pitch you. These guys are great, by the way, and I talk about them in, I think it's chapter 13. We talk about these guys and who they are, and they're actually very likable, and I'd have dinner and a beer with most of them. But they're going to pitch you on saving on the broker fee. But what they don't tell you is they're going to pay cash for your business close in 30 days. It takes longer than 30 days, and they're not actually going to pay you in cash. They're going to do a combination of all these things, and generally they're looking for 2 to 3 months worth of inventory value at no cost, and that's their working capital peg. They come from the larger private equity world, or at least that's where their money comes from, and they always have working capital pegs in there. So to make it comprehensible for the small business owner, they just say, we need 2 to 3 months worth of inventory. They don't call it a working capital peg, but that's exactly what it is. That makes sense?
And the reasoning behind it, just to go over this, not saying it's the right way to approach this, because I also have a fundamental disagreement with it, but the reasoning behind it is a more mature business has a certain amount of cash that is typically not touched in a business. Oh, there we go. My camera just went off. We've been talking too long, Joe. My camera went off.
I'm not even looking at it anyway. So.
Yeah, for those on the YouTube channel. Anyway, so there's a certain amount of cash that a more mature business typically doesn't touch within their business, right? It might be $100,000 that they just keep because they know that they're going to be carrying certain expenses. They're going to be needing that money in order to continue to run the business. Because it's not touched, it becomes a core asset of the business, which is something that is expected to be transferred over. The reality of the negotiation is it often becomes a negotiation piece in which the buying company can reduce the amount of cash that they're paying for your business. And maybe they take a little bit more out of that working capital peg that they put in place. This is always an argument I have for hiring a good CFO, fractional CFO for your company, especially as you break $1 million in revenue or more, to help identify what is our working capital, because that's really what the argument is around. What is the working capital of this business? What are the working capital requirements? And you can set that out from the beginning and have a calculation that supports that. Joe, you say all the time, and you're absolutely right. It's math and logic. So beat them to the math and logic game by having the math and logic out there. If you have a larger transaction, if you have a transaction 10 million or above, expect there to be a working capital peg and be the one to define it. Be the one to say the working capital for my business on a 3-month basis is $150,000, right? And then we can build that into the actual price of the business. We can build that into the asking price. And you're not finding somebody else coming to you with a calculation saying, yeah, your working capital is $725,000. So we're going to take that off of the purchase price because we need that in order to run the business. And that's what you've been using for your business. These things can be calculated, they can be debated, and they can be determined.
Yeah, it could be deep and confusing. I try to simplify it in the book as much as possible. And we're getting into some pretty deep stuff here, folks. But, the way that the book is written is if you're just having a beer with me across the table. I might be drinking a non-alcoholic beer because that's my approach these days. But it's still very conversational. Somebody that read it recently told me it's the clearest and most easy to read M&A book he's ever read. And this particular person has read lots of them because he's in that world. The last thing that is after working capital pegs ties into, a bit of a way to get around paying a working capital peg, and it's inventory notes. Instead of giving them 2 or 3 months worth of inventory, or with any purchase, if you want to help your buyer, which is what you should be doing, right? This has to be a win-win. If you want to help your buyer buy the business with, without putting all of their cash on the table, the easiest possible thing for you to do is an inventory seller note. It's an inventory note. It's not a big seller note that's 12 to 36 months. This one's just tied directly to inventory. And it's a real easy win-win. It's got to be short, 3 to 12 months max, and it's specifically on the inventory. Think about it. Odds are you probably have 3 to 4 months of inventory on hand. If you give them a 4-month inventory note, that might be $200,000 that they don't need to come up with at closing. Remember, they're buying your business at a multiple of discretionary earnings plus the landed cost of goods sellable inventory on hand at the time of closing. But you can calculate that amount and then do an inventory seller note, so they're not having to pay that at closing, and you're getting monthly payments on it that are very short. Again, back to what Mark said, the longer that note is, the riskier it is. Keep this one short. I often like just focus on how often does your inventory turn, and that should be the length of this seller note. And it absolutely should be, you seller, you should get the landed cost of good sellable inventory on a dollar for dollar value, assuming it is good sellable. That's the key thing in there, and landed. You paid to put it on a boat. You went through importing it, customs in the US, and then shipped it to your third-party fulfillment center or to an Amazon fulfillment center, and that all costs money. That should be calculated into your cost of goods sold. It's not just the purchase price. Your $2 on the product or $20 on the product. It's what it costs to get it to the fulfillment center as well. And again, it's paid out in addition to the purchase price. The exception is sometimes those FBA roll-up companies look for that 2 to 3 months worth of inventory. And that landed cost is the key differentiator. But that's it, Mark. We've covered all of them in the deal structures. The next chapter after deal structures is actually negotiating with them and how to negotiate on these different types of deal structures. So we went over variations of cash offers, cash plus all of these different things that can be involved with it, which is seller notes, holdbacks, earnouts, stability payments, rolling equity, and working capital pegs. It is deep, it's involved, but it's me speaking, and it's my words and my language, and y'all know I'm not that smart. So it's pretty easy to read and understand.
And he doesn't have me coming in confusing the topics with additional what I think to be insights. No, this is really good. Again, like I said, this is a complex topic, or it can be a complex topic to try and break apart, but trying to, you've done a good job making this simple, understandable. And the advantage, and I just want to kind of maybe round it out with this, why learn all this stuff? So many people come to me and say, I'm not taking an art out. I'm not doing a seller note. I'm going to do cash. What you effectively are doing is you're reducing your buyer marketplace when you do that significantly. Reducing the buyer marketplace reduces your pricing leverage, which closes you out to potentially good transactions. You don't have to take any of these deals, but knowing how they work and knowing how to evaluate whether or not it's a good deal is really a major aspect of this. So being able to understand this and sit down and read it, and I'm sure when people read this, they're going to see, oh, this makes sense. This isn't that complex. This is actually pretty understandable. It's just going to be a huge help for anyone going into this process, so that you're not trying to evaluate an offer, and when you're looking at these mechanisms for the first time. That's difficult. So being familiar with it is awesome. So congratulations, hats off to you for putting that together.
Yeah, thanks. Again, we're going to give away 3 free chapters of the book. They'll be in the show notes. You should be able to get them from the website, from the podcast page. Actually, it's 4 things. I'm giving away the total intro to the book. So everything that's written there, we've got some nice endorsements. Gino Wickman is on the cover of the book saying this is a must read for online entrepreneurs. Sam Parr from The Hustle and Trends was kind enough to write the foreword. And then we give a detail on what all of the chapters are and go through the entire intro of the book. That's given away. And then we're giving away 3 that I think are key chapters that sellers and buyers can both benefit from. One is a valuation overview, how it works, what buyers are looking for, what they fear, what sellers need. And then chapter 11, which is identifying all of your add backs. And then chapter 15, just what we talked about today, structuring the deal.
Fantastic. Guys, thank you so much. This was a longer episode today. We wanted to delve into a chapter and give you all that free content here in the podcast. If you enjoyed this podcast, take a moment, go over to iTunes, go over to Spotify, wherever you're listening to us, and leave a rating. That would be very, very awesome if you were able to do that. Please do leave a rating. Leave a comment if you got anything out of this episode, something that you learned. Take a look at those show notes. You can find it on our website. Get your free 3 chapters and the intro as well to be able to get a sneak peek at this book. You're going to like it. It's the only book of its kind on the market, or at least it will be once it comes out. It's the only book that's been written like this. So super exciting. Joe, that was a lot, but that was good.
Glad we could do it, Mark.